I'm very happy to be here again with you this morning. Brother Kriyananda seems to be about his father's business, master's business. He's asked me to come, and of course I'm very happy to come to help him out, please him, and also I feel good when I come up here to see you all. I feel the spirit of the Master which is here in this church, and a great part of that is due also to Sister Mira's wonderful attitude and her consciousness, which she expresses so much, many of the characteristics of the Master, his love, and so naturally it's a great joy to come and say a few words to you. Our subject this morning, I see, is Awaken Your Divine Will. Awaken your divine will. To realize divine will, we should, of course, know something first about human will. Human will. Human will is the will of the ego. Realize that. That is, when you do a certain thing, when you exercise your human will, it is stimulated, so to speak, by your ego consciousness. And the instruments of your ego consciousness are the senses, the mind, and the intellect. And so you can gather together so much will from the ego. It is limited. It is limited by the instruments through which it works. But when you utilize divine will, or when you supersede this human will by divine will, it is unlimited. Because through divine will, creation has come. All things have been made, have come from what? From God's divine will. And so you can see that if you can supersede your human will by divine will, you can realize that your powers are unlimited. And there's nothing, no obstacle that cannot be overcome. Realize that. Understand the difference between human will and divine will. One is limited, and the ego is operating, so to speak, human will. And who's operating divine will? God. God is in us. His consciousness is in us. Our own awareness is His awareness. But there's a separation there. There's a delusion. Remove the delusion and God works through us unobstructedly. That's divine will. Now realize the difference. People try to do things by the power of their own will. Ego-operated will. It's impossible. But when God steps in, then you can do something real about it. You can really do something with your will, because then your will is guided by God's wisdom-guided will. As we said in our affirmation, I will reason, I will act, but guide thou, O Father, me to do the right thing. In other words, get to contact with God first. Do that. Realize your oneness with Him. Then you can utilize divine will. In fact, your will is divine will. Now, success or failure does not depend upon the size or the number of obstacles which we encounter. It does not depend upon that at all. But it depends on our ability or lack of ability to overcome them. That's all. And I might say in passing, even if you do not overcome, but you unite your consciousness with God's presence, you are a success, even though you are a failure in the ordinary sense of the word. Realize that. And so no matter what obstacles come, realize you can overcome them if you utilize the power which is within you, the presence of God. If it is not His will that that obstacle be overcome, you still are a success, because your consciousness is one with God's consciousness. That is what we must understand and realize. And so, even though we have a strong will, let us understand this, even though we have a strong will, a powerful will, but we do not keep it steady, then obstacles may overcome us instead of we overcoming them. And even if you have a weak will, even the weakest obstacle will overcome you. And so it is not so much what your will is. It is that you change that will and reinforce it, back it up by the presence of God within you, and then keep it steady. Some people start off with a great flourish to find God, and they fall flat. The enthusiasm disappears. That's not steady will. But he who keeps at it, everlastingly at it, realizing he wants one thing, God alone, then his will, even though it is weak, is steady, then it grows. Then it becomes united with God's will, then he can overcome. Change your will. Change your will from human will to divine will, or awaken within you divine will. Now, this steady will, we must say a word or two about steady will. It's very important. Some people haven't got too strong a will, but they keep at it. They keep poking. So they'll bob up here and poke at you. And they'll come over here. They're at it everlastingly. That's steady will. If you have a strong will, plus that steady will, that's wonderful. Now we need a steady will to overcome. We need a steady will to change our human will to divine will. Because all our senses and all the energy from our muscles and from our organs, normally it's passing outward. As you live in this world, those energies are going outward. And it takes a strong will to turn them back on themselves and turn them inward to the source of divine will. As long as you are utilizing these energies which are passing outward through sensation, mind, and intellect, you'll get so much power to your will. But if you can turn that energy on itself and turn it back into your soul, so to speak, then it will awaken within you divine will, and then you'll have God's wisdom-guided will to utilize. Now, realize the first thing we have to do is to turn the energy which is going into outward consciousness and therefore keeps us limited. By this duality of consciousness, we have to turn it on itself, turn it back in. And what do we do? Through the practices of self-realization techniques, we gather that energy, first in the spine, the superficial spine, sympathetic nervous system, if you want to call it that. But first you do that. Then you got it where you can do something with it. Because where is divine will located? Not in sensation, not in mind and intellect, but right within yourself in the deep spine, and it is contacted through the Christ center at this point. So you gather first. You gather these energies which have created you and keep you in this creation. You turn them back on themselves into your spine, then it comes up and you bring it to the point of the spiritual eye. So the second step is by the power of your will, augmented by that force you've gathered together in the sympathetic nervous system or the superficial spine. Those of you who had Kriya know what I'm talking about. What do? You push it in through the spiritual eye. Force it in through there. And then where does it go? It goes into the deep spine. That's where your soul resides. That's where your powers are. That's where your subtle powers are. Not in sensation, not in mind and intellect. Those are limited. The power of the soul is deep within yourself, in your spinal region, in the sushumna, in the deep spine. Now what happens there? Just like you put yeast in the bread, it goes all through, doesn't it? What do they call it? Leavens the bread. So when you put that energy into the deep spine where the soul resides, what does it do? It arouses the power of God at the base of the spine, the Kundalini power. It's sleeping there. It's in every one of us. It arouses it. Stimulates it a little bit, then it gets going. That's the law of God. It arouses it, and then it rises up the spine, and what's it do? It stimulates the centers of the spine, the places where God's energy is accumulated, and it finally stimulates the great center in the brain. That's why saints know more than ordinary people. That's why the saints are so strong in will, because they have aroused the divine will which is sleeping at the base of the spine, known as the Kundalini power. Now when that arouses, that enlivens the centers of the spine, finally the great center in the brain, and then you have aroused the divine will within you. Because divine will comes into us through the medulla center, we see it at this point, we contact it at this point, it is stored in the great thousand-rayed lotus of the brain. Now these are facts. You do not have to remember all the intricate facts, but that's what happens. Whether you do it consciously or not, when you turn your attention within and arouses the great divine energy, it comes to this point, and as Master says, you sail your consciousness through the spiritual eye into the omnipresence of God, which is right within yourself. As it says in Revelation, the kingdom of God is within man. It's right within the brain, and all things are there. It's right from here to the top of the head. That's where divine will is. When you won't find it out in sensation or mind or intellect, you'll find it right there. But you have to go there. And you have to follow someone who went there, as our beloved Master. So that is what steady will means. Steady will means to keep at it until you gather your energy. First, superficially. Secondly, you put it through the spiritual eye. If your mind is running all over the place and you're looking there, you're not doing anything. But if you concentrate at that point and use what will you have, then you arouse the greater will of the spine, the presence of God, known as the Kundalini power. Arousing that stimulates the centers of the spine where the presence of God lives and dwells. Being one with that, you feel His presence. You have superseded your human will with divine will. Master has said a wonderful thing in his little book, Metaphysical Meditation. Excuse me. Master said, better book, right? In his book, the Master said, he says these wonderful words. It is your adamant will that will give you victory. Not a haphazard will, not a lazy will, a steady will. It is your adamant will that will give you victory. And he goes on, it is better to have a strong will than a perfect body. It is better to have a strong will than a perfect body. The more you emphasize the mortal, the more mortal you become. The more you emphasize the spirit, the more you will become spirit. And don't you see, by utilizing your will, not in outward things, we have to do that, we have to live, but utilizing your will more in the attaining of the presence of God, at this point you will become more spiritual. And as the Master says, it's better to have a strong spiritual will or a strong will, even if you have a weak body. What of it? If you have the presence of God, that's worth everything. Everything. You wouldn't swap it for anything. Realize this. Now, the men of the strongest will are who? Saints. Saints. Why? Just as I have said, they have united their human will with God's will. They have aroused the Kundalini power within them, and they have aroused the spiritual centers within them so that their human will is divine will. That's all. And you know the Master said, a saint is what? A sinner who didn't give up. He didn't stop trying. He didn't stop meditating. He meditated more, as the Master, as we read in his little story, that he meditated, what was it, 2 days? Do we do that? Well, a little while, morning and night, we're lucky. But even with that much, you can supersede your human will with the presence of divine will within you. Now, oh yes, I have a little story here. You're all familiar with the frog story, aren't you? Where the frogs fell head over heels into the pail of milk. 2 of them, one little one and one big one. And so they began to paddle. They couldn't jump out over, but they had to keep going. And so finally the big fellow, he gave up easily. He didn't have steady will. He was just an ordinary frog, I guess, only big. So he gave up and drowned in the milk. But the little fellow kept on. He says, as the Master says, it's better to have a strong will even though you have a weak body. So he said, I'll keep on. And he kept on paddling. Finally, he felt a little something under his little feet. And the little butter had formed, so he got the solid foundation and jumped to freedom. So realize that. I think the story is something like that. And near enough, anyway. And so, even though you're small and weak, keep at it. God will never let you go. God will never let you drown in the milk of delusion, so to speak. He will keep you steadfast, even if you have a weak body, if you keep at it and do not lose faith in Him. But if you give Him up, what can He do? He's given us free will. So realize we must everlastingly keep at it like the little frog. And so, to awaken your divine will, you must start right where you are now. Don't think next week I'm going to start, or next year when I get this better house, or conditions are better, they'll maybe worse then. At least they may be the same. They're not apt to be better. It doesn't work that way. Start right where you are now. And the first thing, as the Master says to do, is to make up your mind now. Make up your mind now. You're going to strengthen your will. Mind can create anything. Mind, I mean the presence of God in us, utilizing your mind. Start right where you are now and do something which you have failed to do before. Try something in which you have failed. Now, there are lots of those things. Don't take too big a thing, because you may fail again right off. But take something that you have failed, some small thing, and be sure the second thing is that it's sensible and practical. If you want to make $1 million, that's not practical, not now, because you have to give most of it back to the government. But realize, try something that's simple and something you've failed before in, and start. And the third thing is to keep everlastingly at it, and don't take no for an answer, even if it kills you. Now, these are facts. I've heard the Master say that many times. He says, better to lose your body than to give up. So understand that. That's the way to strengthen your will, that you change and supersede your will to divine will. Take some simple thing, something you failed in before, and there's plenty of those things. We all have things that we have failed in. And be sure it's practical and sensible. And then say, now this is going to be done if it kills me. And keep at it until you do it. Now, if you'll do that, that's the greatest step. One of the first things we must do to strengthen our will. And finally, the key to awaken your divine will is, as I have said, to unite your will with the all-powerful will of God. People get the wrong idea. They think they're going to strengthen the human will. You will strengthen it somewhat. You start with that. But it takes lots of willpower to meditate regularly every day, morning and night and through the day. And keep your mind, when you do meditate, it takes willpower to keep your mind concentrated on that upon which you are meditating. You cannot escape. It gets you every way. And as you look at the spiritual eye, keep your mind there. Try it. Where does it go? Flitting all around. Why? Lack of willpower, that's all. And so, if you are to tune your mind with divine will, you must realize that you have to first get God contact. Realize that. That's why I emphasized this morning as we meditated together on Om. Didn't you all feel peaceful? I thought it was wonderful this morning. Now, that's the presence of God. And if you can get that first, that's the greatest step toward changing human will to divine will. Master has said this in his autobiography. A few words which I like to quote. He says, the common stone locks within itself the secret of stupendous atomic energy. The common stone locks within itself the secret of stupendous atomic energy, cosmic energy. And then he goes on to say, even so, a mortal is yet a powerhouse of divinity. What's the matter with that? If a stone has such atomic energy within us, we made in the image of God, what's the matter with us? We have divinity within us. We have the powerhouse of divine will within us. We have to realize that. And so, attunement with God or divine will simply means attaining God contact and being able at will to contact the presence of God. And as he has made universe upon universe, don't you think you'll have sufficient will? I'm sure we will. But we must contact God first. Make the contact with it. Make the connection. And then we shall have plenty of divine will. Now, self-realization gives us the ways and the means of contacting God. We do not stress in self-realization so much of the ordinary church activities, of suppers, and all sorts of meetings, sales, and so forth. But we stress more God contact in our meetings. Like in the ordinary churches, they have sales, and they have, the Wednesday night suppers and lots of things. I've forgotten, it's been such a long time. And one woman came to me and she said, we had a rummage sale last Wednesday down to the church. and all the women took their husbands. Perhaps you will catch it after a while. Use your will now. All the ladies took their husbands. Must have been quite a rummage sale, huh? So, had to have a little breathing spell, that's all. And so, realize we are connected with divine will through the medulla center. Through the medulla center. God's power flows in through each and every one of us. Otherwise, how do you think you sit there and look around and do all the things you do? Even listen to me, because God's power is flowing through you. And so His will comes in through the medulla center. Now, we realize that if we develop the spiritual eye at this point, we are in connection with the source of God's power within us through the medulla center and that great storehouse of His energy and consciousness of the brain, or the astral brain. We find that through the medulla center. And so, what do we have to do? We have to develop the spiritual eye, that's all. Master has said in his AY, long continued concentration on the liberating spiritual eye takes away all delusion from the devotee. And he realizes God is the sole doer, and he might even add he realizes his will is one with God's will when he makes the connection. And so, if boring into the uranium atom will give us such atomic power, as you all read about these explosions and all the things that are going on, why? By boring into the uranium atom, what power will we receive by boring into the spiritual eye? We receive the power of the universe. We do not realize what we have. The great saints do. And so understand that. Develop the spiritual eye. That you bore into there and tap the source of all things, God's great power. If you can do that, then you will realize that you have superseded your human will with God's great will. Now, one or two other things and then we'll be through. The important thing is this, that there is no limit, as I have said, to the power you can develop at the spiritual eye. For what purpose? I used to go to the Master and I wanted to see visions and all those things. And he said, why don't you ask God to reveal himself? And I said, that's right. That's more sensible. Having God, he can give me what he wants. He can give me what's best for me. He can give me everything. And so realize, as you develop contact with God at this power, there's no limit. There's no limit to what you can do. But one mistake we must not make. Many people do this. They jump first. They act first. Then they get into a mess, and Father, get me out. Get me out of the mess. These are truths. Therefore, what should we do? Make the contact with God first. Make the contact with Him first. Get that communion with God. I will reason, I will act, but Father, give me the contact with you first. You understand? Don't jump first. Make the contact with God, and then, having His guidance, having the guidance of the Holy Ghost, the great Comforter, then you will utilize your power through will in the right way. And so, realize God is the secret of all power. God is what you want to change your human will to divine will. All power comes from Him. Everything we do, all our functions go on because we are connected with God. Make the connection in a conscious way. And when you see the presence of God in you, as the holy vibration at this point is the light of His presence, or you hear the cosmic sound reverberating through you, or you feel in your heart His great divine love, understand you have made the connection with God. You have made the contact with God. Then what do? Then you demand, as His child, that His great power flow through you. Now, if you want to awaken the divine will within you, do just that. Make the contact first. Feel His presence within you. And then demand, as His child, which we are, that His great power flow through you. Then you will awaken within you divine will. And I will close by reading just a few lines from one of the Master's letters to me. I like to close with this because they are so wonderful and they apply not only to me but to every one of you. Every one of us is a child of God. No one has a corner on God. Thank God for that. No one has a corner on him like they do in politics and such things. God is open to all. He's ready to all. He's ready to allow everyone to utilize his divine will and his power. So Master, writing from Denver back in 1931, wrote these beautiful lines to me. He says, "Dear Doctor, I am more than ever with God." Now, if the Master found it necessary to be more and more with God, why shouldn't we? And so he says, "I am more than ever with God. I have entirely lost consciousness of defeats and victories, for God told me in Phoenix, when I asked that I wanted freedom from everything, he said, 'You are already free.'" Realize now what you're hearing. You are already free, but think you are not because you looked for freedom in the future. Isn't that wonderful? Tomorrow we're going to begin, we say, or next week, or when conditions are better, then I'm going to meditate more. Now, as the Master says, you are already free, but think you are not because you look for freedom in the future. And then he ends with these beautiful words. Whether the dance of death or the dance of life comes at your doors, know that they come from me, and as such rejoice. No matter what comes, rejoice, it's from God. And then he ends with these words, "Thou hast me. What more dost thou want?" Realize, thou hast me. You have God. I have God. What more do we want? Thou hast me. What more do you want? I am with thee always. God is with us always. We doubt it, that's all. We lose faith. God is with us always. These are the Master's words. And the Master, and since then, he says, I cease to expect anything. If you know God is with you, and you feel that and know it in your soul, you won't expect anything. You have everything, because you have God. So awaken your divine will by making the God contact, and then demanding as his child, Father, thou art with me, I have everything. I am your child.